So I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. They have, I think, an enormous breadth of experience and can speak to the campaign sausage making that Josh discussed at great length. Let me start with my left. Avik Roy is an opinion editor at Forbes. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where I am also a fellow. He's advising Senator Marco Rubio on policy for the 2016 presidential campaign. Earlier in 2015, he served as the senior advisor for former Texas Governor Rick Perry. In 2012, he served as health policy advisor to Mitt Romney. He writes regularly for National Review and has a host of other activities that he engages in within the health policy space. Avik, thank you so much for joining us today. To his left, John Noonan is the national security advisor to Governor Jeb Bush's campaign for president. He previously served as Governor Mitt Romney's national security advisor during the 2012 presidential election. He spent 4 years as the spokesman for the House Committee on Armed Services Majority, former policy director for the Foreign Policy Initiative, and he's been a contributor to multiple publications, including the Weekly Standard. Chris Perkins is a pollster with the Ted Cruz campaign and partner at WPA Research in Austin, Texas. He has over a decade of experience in campaign strategy, grassroots, and message development. He has significant background in corporate, nonprofit, and external coalition building, and has trained hundreds of activists through a number of different programs. And finally, my friend Timmy Teepell is Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal's chief of staff. He managed the governor's race and won it, obviously, and served as chief strategist on Governor Jindal's re-election campaign, won it by a historic margin. He's previously worked with the RGA and a number of other Republican groups. If you'll join me in just giving our panel a round of applause. So, gentlemen, I actually want to start with a basic question about policy in the 2016 presidential election, and I want you to know in advance, while I understand this is not a campaign debate, I do welcome debate on these points. So if you hear things from someone else on this panel who you disagree with, feel free to jump in. Don't wait to have me offer a question to you. But let's start with this. There was certainly a lot of anticipation, I think, from a number of different corners heading into 2016 that we were going to have finally a serious policy debate about a number of different issue areas. An expectation that those issue areas would be working through what the next president would be dealing with when it came to healthcare, when it came to the economy, when it came to education, when it came to energy, all these different issues. Do any of you believe that we are actually having that debate right now within the current field of Republican candidates?
It appears we're having a debate on how high Marco Rubio's heels are right now, right? I know going into this year, we faced the same thing. We spent the year prior looking at healthcare, energy, and then the campaign went in a different direction. I guess Donald Trump just became a show.
All right, let it be known that that took 2.5 minutes. No,
remarkable.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who would look at it and agree with you. I know that you all have been sort of looking at this from a number of different perspectives, but Avik in particular, you've been working through what comes after Obamacare, and been part of a debate with Governor Jindal, with others about, kind of what that looks like. Are we actually having that conversation now, and why do you think that we are or are not?
Well, on healthcare specifically, actually, I've been complaining on Twitter whenever I watch these debates about the fact that no one has asked any questions, not one question really, if I can recall, on how would you replace Obamacare in a way that would elicit differences among the candidates, or at least elicit ideas among the candidates. The question has not been asked, maybe because it's a complex subject, I'm not sure. Or maybe because the journalists, the moderators, don't feel that there's enough disagreement there to create the fireworks on TV. But to go back to your original question, let me tell an anecdote from my time in the Perry campaign, which I think will be interesting to this group. So we worked on a big policy initiative at the governor's behest on Wall Street reform. Let's make sure that one of the biggest problems of the last 10 years has been the bank bailouts. Let's reform the financial system so we never have to bail out banks ever again. This is a huge problem that, frankly, the conservative movement from a standpoint of policy and the intellectuals have not invested a lot of energy in. And this was an opportunity to really differentiate, in the governor's view, his campaign from other campaigns. So we worked on this, developed a very, in my view, interesting and thoughtful and wide-ranging proposal on how to do this, how to make sure that we'll never have to bail out the big banks again, an end too big to fail for good. So he gave a speech at the Yale Club of New York in front of all these finance types and told them, we're never not going to bail out the banks again. And he got a standing ovation at the end of the speech. It was a 2-hour session. Steve Forbes and Larry Kudlow moderated. There were a lot of interesting, intelligent questions. After the Q&A was over, there was one question from the audience, the very last question of this 2-hour lunch, where some guy from, I think, the Daily Mail or the Guardian raised his hand and said, Governor Perry, I had the opportunity to meet with Donald Trump earlier today, and I asked him about you, and he said that your eyeglasses were fake and you were just wearing them to look smart, and that you weren't tough enough to be president. And everyone in the audience groaned, like we've been having this incredibly substantive conversation about Wall Street reform for 2 hours. And Governor Perry, just kind of shook his head and said, look, I mean, this is obviously stupid. If Donald Trump thinks I'm not tough enough, I guess we could be in middle school and have a pull-up contest or something. Just trying to make fun of the question, right? Mm-hmm. The rest of that, for the next 24 hours, what do you think the headline of Rick Perry's 2-hour Wall Street initiative was? Rick Perry challenges Donald Trump to a pull-up contest. And this was CNN, Time, the New York Times, all the so-called mainstream media that consider themselves to be the substantive journalists. That's the only thing they wrote about. They didn't write about all of the content in that very serious initiative. And I think that's, to me, indicative of what we've been dealing with over the last 12 months.
Chris, as the representative of the polling industry, to give you a little bit of a broad swath there on this panel, do you think that the problem here is really an issue of, is it an issue of media? Is it an issue of campaign strategists finding it difficult to navigate around that media? Is it what the people actually want to hear? What's going on?
It's a little of both. I mean, what you're really dealing with is it's a little bit of, like Avik said, that we can have serious policy debate, and what they want to talk about is pull-up contest. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the sheer volume of candidates. I think there's an attempt by the candidates to have a serious policy debate. But when you have so many candidates, it becomes, how do you distinguish your particular set of policies or opinion from the other ones when there's a sheer volume of them? The media is going to write whatever the media is going to write to drive readers, to drive people to their sites, whatever it is. I think there's an attempt, but it also is very difficult, especially from a national perspective, to communicate a single message to the Republican primary electorate, or to the Republican primary voter. For the most part, everybody on the debate stage and off the debate stage who are candidates for president, there's not a lot of difference between each particular person's policy. I mean, I would like to suggest about 88% of the candidates agree on most of the issues, so the differences are relatively small. However, articulating that between 12, 14 people becomes rather difficult from a mechanical standpoint. How do you have the debate when the coverage is so focused on what Donald Trump said stupid today?
So two of you represent candidates who are in the U.S. Senate. Two of you represent candidates who have long gubernatorial histories. It has been assumed for as long as I can possibly remember that presidents come from the governor's seat, that the executive leadership that comes out of that experience is something critical that flows into campaigns. And yet it seems that some of our most innovative governors across the country, on a host of different subjects, on healthcare, on education, on criminal justice reform, on higher ed, et cetera, have been some of the people who found it hardest to navigate that environment. I'd be curious, John, in terms of telling that story that comes out of things, we've seen the challenges other candidates have had coming from that. Have we reached a point now where it's actually easier to run as someone who doesn't have that executive gubernatorial record that has to be explained versus someone who maybe is coming from the U.S. Senate and is familiar more with talking about national issues to a TV audience, that sort of thing?
I think we'll find out in 1 or 2 months. No, it's a great question, and I think one of the challenges that we faced on the Jeb Bush campaign is here we have a governor who has an incredible conservative record, pioneered school choice, was outstanding in revolutionizing the way states took power back from the federal government, George Will called him the most conservative governor since Reagan. And Avik, Chris, the three of you, you're absolutely right. It's hard to get that message to break through. And if I can pile on the last question, here I'll give you an example, another anecdote. We unveiled a national security strategy. It was substantive. It was talking about reversing the Obama defense cuts, what we were going to do, what was America's role in the world. It talked about it in a very serious and very real way. 2 weeks after that policy was rolled out, we had the Paris attacks. This was before San Bernardino. Very first question that the governor got the week after he gave a major national security address, where it was after Paris, where he talked about his national security strategy, he talked about his plan for defeating ISIS. John Dickinson gets him on Face the Nation and says, "Governor, one of your staffers said something stupid on Twitter about Donald Trump. Do you back that up?" And so it's very much a cult of personality right now, and having or figuring out the media in a way where you can get policy to break through to make it into the national discourse is tough. And I think Chris is exactly right. They're all conservatives. We have an incredibly talented field. There is not a lot of daylight on the major issues: pro-choice, pro-Second Amendment, strong national defense, with the exception of Rand Paul. And look, in an ideal world, I would love it if we all sat around and read GAO and CBO reports and went through the data and the statistics. But people watch the news, and we as a people understand politics in the same way that we understand media or stories, right? We create a hero, we create a villain, and we understand through that conflict who our guy is and who it isn't. It's just the reality of a digital age. It's a reality of a 24-hour media cycle, and it's a reality that every campaign is going to have to deal with. And by the way, that stupid staffer who said a dumb thing about Donald Trump was John Noonan.
Was the dumb thing something you can say to an audience of these nice people?
Yeah, it's out there. So he had done as Donald Trump is wont to do, and he said that he would be open to forcing Muslim Americans into a registration. And I thought I was making a fairly obvious point that forced federal regulations is about as far from conservatism as you can get, and it resembles a certain period in the 1930s in the Bavarian region of Europe. I used a stronger term for it than that. And Chris Moody from Yahoo News picked it up and retweeted it, and all of a sudden, it's your staffer. It's a staffer's worst nightmare to have your boss asked about something stupid you said. And it was an interesting Thanksgiving. We'll just leave it at that.
So, Avik, you've had the unique experience of going from one to the other in the same cycle of someone who had a long, outstanding gubernatorial record, one that certainly I think everyone can view as being a significant conservative success on so many different fronts, having to tell that story for the second time to someone who's now on the national scene. So what do you think about that question?
Yeah, I mean, when you asked it originally, I was thinking about that in my own experience. I mean, the reason I moved down to Austin from New York City and signed on with Governor Perry was precisely for that reason, because I felt that he had the most compelling gubernatorial record of anyone running, with all due respect to your fine boss. I thought that the Texas economic miracle of the last 14 years was not an accident. It was a result of great policy coming from this institution, from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and Rick Perry. That partnership has achieved incredible things and advanced all of our abilities to talk about how conservative policy can make life better for everyone, and not just, by the way, the rich, but everyone. Opportunities for the poor, opportunities for minorities. So this was a story that I was looking forward to telling. And I will also say that one of the things about Rick Perry that I really liked was that he's by temperament a risk taker. He likes to actually innovate on policy. He isn't just trying to do the things that the think tanks are telling him to do. He's actually willing to push the envelope. So for all those reasons, I thought Perry was really appealing. But the fact that he had his issues in 2011, people just couldn't get over that, and you can't blame voters for that. He just never had the oxygen necessary to get through that, I think. And as to your point, I think in this cycle that the gubernatorial experience has just not been at a premium the way it has been in previous cycles. Now, talking about Senator Rubio, Senator Rubio, some of this may have to do with the internet, right? So that in an internet-driven age, where, look at Scott Walker. Why did Scott Walker fail? One of the main reasons why Scott Walker failed is because he had to spend so much time in Wisconsin fighting to get reelected 3 times in 4 years. They never had any time to really get solid on national issues. And so when he's on this national stage, now with the internet, someone puts a microphone in front of you and you say the wrong thing, and then it's a Twitter a storm for a week. That was something he just had a lot of trouble with. And I think the candidates, the senators who've been fluent in national issues and had to deal with them every day in the national spotlight for years and years, they have less of those mistakes.
So Timmy, I'm curious as to your take on this, because you've been able to see this play out over multiple cycles, pre-Tea Party stuff and everything that's come since then, the rise of social media. Do you agree that that's one of the big factors that has changed the way that campaigns have to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think the internet, the 24-hour news cycle, the vast majority of Americans at this point in the campaign, or at least over the past 3 months, watching the campaign was more entertainment value than having to make a decision. When you go to the early states in Iowa, New Hampshire, people are actually interested in the issues. They ask detailed questions. They're actually trying to absorb what are the policy differences between candidates. They're very deliberate. They're very conscientious. They're very serious about how they vote. I think it's something that is good about our system. The fact that we have smaller states, early states, vet these candidates. But this year it seems like it's gotten much more national in scope, the election. In the past you'd have governors, little-known governors like a Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, who may not have been on the national stage, but they spent time in Iowa going from farmhouse to farmhouse. They went into people's living rooms. People got to know them, they kicked the tires, and they had time to do that because people weren't writing their obituaries 8 months before the election happened. And so because of that, you're able to have these governors who may have been well known within their state, but not on the national stage, go to Iowa, get to know people, and then they would, boom, come out of Iowa with a lot of national attention because they spent time there. This year, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's a much more national election, and it seems like we're moving to a much more national election. And with the national polls deciding debate criteria and things like that, it created a much more heavy emphasis on national polling and running a green room campaign. Mm-hmm. You have to be on Fox News, you have to be on CNN, you have to make headlines. It's not enough to just go from farmhouse to farmhouse and talk about the issues and roll out good policy and strong policy and go to the debates and handle yourself well. You have to be, go from green rooms in D.C. to New York and get on the national news in order to get your poll numbers up.
So the question I think that comes out of that is doesn't that suggest that, regardless of what you think of the Trump phenomenon, that he is something that isn't going away in terms of an approach to running on a national stage, that you do want to make headlines in that way?
Mm-hmm. I think that this is a new norm.
So, Chris, what do you think about this in the sense that, do you think that the appetite in the internet age for kind of the digestibility of these messages has gotten down to that 140 character limit or something like that, where
Sure.
it might have before been newspaper article length, or not GAO length, but certainly something a little bit more substantive?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the manner in which our voters consume information today, like Timmy was saying, is substantially changed over the last number of cycles, years, whatever you want to call it. So that becomes the way the campaigns have to focus is, yes, there's one side of that, just like Timmy and Avik were saying, about understanding the social media phenomenon, the digital age. But the other side of that from a campaign infrastructure is understanding how the data works to get that message to your proper voters. And that is obviously a key in organizing a national campaign. Now, as it relates to polling, as we were just talking about, I mean, I'm waiting for the question, is the national polling real? Is the national polling real? Well, let's talk about that for a second. I will point out that I'm not going to suggest that it's real. A poll is a poll. The outlets can do a poll how they want and show it in the manner that they want. I'm not suggesting that it's inaccurate information, but just think back 8 years ago when it became mathematically impossible. 8 years ago, Rudy Giuliani was winning in the national polls, yet had 0% chance to win the actual Republican nomination. Now, moving forward to looking at the way the national polls are reflective now, yes, I mean, Donald Trump is winning in pretty much every national poll that you have, but there also becomes a way to look at the way the ideological side of our Republicans are categorized. And this is an unusual side because the media doesn't want to write this story, but let's play a game. Let's say Donald Trump is, say, at 30% on the national side. Usually, not every poll, but most of the polls will ask the Republican primary voters, do you consider yourself, what's your ideological? Very conservative, somewhat conservative, moderate, or liberal. If he's at 30%, he's at about 22 with very conservatives, about 30 with somewhat, about 40 with moderates, and obviously liberals are a very small part of the Republican primary electorate, but he gets up into large or very large 50, 60% percentile. So what that suggests, if you're looking at a national poll, not knowing if these are voters or non-voters, is that his support is driven by the less conservative the voter. Now, are these people that are going to show up in the Republican primary? That's the part we don't know. But that also leads to the side of of the opening of the discussion, how voters are getting their information. And when you have a particular campaign that is doing very well at earned media, that is the reason why you'll see national polls in a way that you won't see the particular state-to-state polls, which are the deciding elements of the nomination.
Do you personally think, just obviously from Trump's perspective, he maintains that were I not in the field, we would not be talking about certain things. We would not be talking about immigration. We would not be talking. Do you think that this is a situation where you have someone who has just lined up with people's priorities in a way that elite priorities were not lined up? Where if we might be wanting to talk about what comes after Obamacare in a complex issue, there are other people who just have other priorities? Or is there something else there going on?
I mean, I'm sure that's what he's going to say. I mean, he's going to say, I'm driving the national debate, and there's an element of truth to that because that's what the media wants to cover. It's not so much that he's a presidential candidate, and before he was a businessman, and so he's a brand that they want to cover. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that's what he's going to say, but whether that's true or not, it's really difficult to suggest.
So when it comes to debating those complex issues, though, John, I mean, I think a good example of this is one where you have a governor who has put out significant policy papers. Obviously, this is something that Jindal did. It's something that Governor Perry did. But that's also kind of a format that doesn't really work for this day and age. So how can you cut through that type of headline limit? Or is it something that you have to kind of find a happy medium between?
Yeah, I think Chris nailed it. It's the media is driven, it's a business. And it's driven by viewers, it's driven by clicks. You obviously know this, running the Federalist. And people don't get jazzed by talking about the latest Medicare numbers. They do get jazzed over Rick Perry said this about Marco Rubio or Marco Rubio's boots or John Noonan's stupid Twitter account because like I said earlier, we feed off of conflict, and that's, I mean, what better arena is there than a presidential election? It's been like that for a long time.
But for a candidate like yours who has been away from this kind of fray for a little bit longer than some of the others, how can you adapt to that in the sense that Jeb Bush is obviously a guy who I think a lot of us can respect. He's someone who has accomplished great things in his state, and yet that seriousness seems divorced from the current conversation.
I think that's right, but I think Chris made a very important point as far as making policy breakthrough, and that is elections are not won in national polls. They're won in voter-to-voter contact in the town hall format. They're won in Iowa, they're won in New Hampshire, they're won in South Carolina, they're won in the March 1st states. And Governor Bush admits himself that he is not the showman that Donald Trump is. He doesn't claim to be. But take the opportunity, if you can, to watch him interact with New Hampshire voters or interact with Iowa voters. He has a way of making his policies stick, and he has a way of making his policies understood to Joe Schmo from Portsmouth. And I think that's a tough thing to do.
So we're going to move to questions here in a minute, but I have one more sort of larger question for you all, and I'd love to hear responses from you all on this. I think one of the critical questions that Chris DeMuth and a number of other intellectuals have kind of put forward over the past couple of months is how does the next president adapt to the post-Obama reality of the authoritarian presidency? If you can consider Trump as someone who has basically embraced that wholeheartedly and just says all these things that he's going to do regardless of whether they're constitutional or not, that kind of debate, it is a situation where, because the president has been so willing to act in extra-legal authoritarian ways, there is an expanded power to this office now that exists in the White House, at least in some sense. This is something that's going to challenge the next president, from a lot of different perspectives, because the natural tendency would be, don't go back to a Madisonian system. Don't go back to something that looks like the old way of approaching it. Instead, use the authoritarian of the power of the presidency for good. You can think of it as Boromir's argument from The Lord of the Rings. I can turn this weapon against my enemy. Avik, I want to start with you and then go across. How is the next president, regardless of whether it's Marco Rubio or anybody other, how should they respond to what is going to be a very tempting environment, I think, to engage in a lot of authoritarian behavior?
Yeah, let me make a couple of points related to that question. The first is one of the reasons why President Obama has deployed the executive authority the way he has is because Madisonian government is working, right? It's been very difficult to pass legislation. That's how the Madisonian system was designed. Frankly, that's something I think a lot of our friends in the conservative movement sometimes get frustrated with. We forget that there's this Madisonian system that makes it difficult to pass our agenda. We say, well, why hasn't Congress repealed Obamacare? Well, there's this guy named the president who gets to veto repeal legislation, so that's part of the challenge, right? So the Madisonian system works in both directions and has been a brake on the agendas of both sides. The second point I would make that's very important is Congress has actually voluntarily assigned much of its legislative authority to the executive branch. So to give the example of Obamacare, and we could give examples on the Republican side as well, I think in Obamacare there's something like several hundred, like 405, you might know the number, of instances where the words, "the secretary shall," appear in the text of the Affordable Care Act. And what that basically means is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, we're going to pass a law saying there's going to be universal coverage. The Health and Human Services Secretary will figure out how to actually make that happen. And so a lot of regulatory authority thereby is given to the executive branch. So with those two premises in mind, what's the solution? The solution is first to say, okay, in areas where President Obama has overstepped his legal authority, the next president will use his pen and his phone to reverse those particular measures. But second, we have to make sure that we have a congressional, legislative, statutory agenda that rolls back the deference that Congress has by its own voluntary actions assigned to the executive branch.
John, you're someone who's had experience on the congressional side. You understand the resistance for why so many members of Congress actually don't want that on their hands, don't you?
Yeah, I think if given a choice, your average congressman will always defer to the politically safe. But and I don't blame them. It's the nature of the business. And I had the benefit of working for a fantastic Texan named Mac Thornberry, who is who's a little different. He's somebody who's policy curious. He's policy hungry. He would sit down every day. He would read the GAO reports. He'd read the CBO reports. And, call me naive, but I really do think that if our elected representatives, and we have a lot of good ones in Congress, as much as we like to beat up on the legislative branch, I really do think if they have good in their heart, like Congressman Thornberry does, which is waking up every morning and says, what's the right policy for my district? What's the right policy for the country? And he does it within the contextual framework, as you outline, checks and balances, then we're going to be in pretty good shape. I'll just make this very quick point. Governor Bush is very unique. I've done this before. I've done presidential campaigns before. Governor Bush's challenge was something I had never really experienced before to his policy shop, which was, I don't want the politically correct policy. I want what's best for the country, just like Chairman Thornberry. But he also said something very interesting. He said, this needs to be able to get through Congress. We need to operate in the realm of reality here. We need to inch the ball forward rather than maybe throwing Hail Mary passes like Obamacare was. And that's how you advance a conservative agenda. That's how I did it in Florida. I did it with the legislature, not against the legislature, and I'm going to do it with the Congress as president. And I think that's exactly the right mentality to have, and it was attractive to me.
So, Chris, imagine a scenario where President Cruz is faced with a decision of this nature, where the polling from a majority of Republicans says, do this, make this happen, and regardless of what the sort of the constitutional questions, that creates a significant tension. How would you approach this question?
Well, the fortunate side is we have a Republican majority in the House and a Republican majority in the Senate. And if that position were to be there, I mean, the Republican majority, if the conservative voters say this is what should happen, that would be horrible for the Republican majority in the House and the Senate to go against those voters. So there becomes an idea of leadership on that side. We were just talking about how do you govern. I will admit to not being a policy expert, but from a governing perspective, yes, it is a very different way that in this day and age that the President of the United States does have to communicate or get a message out to the American people, but it puts an extraordinary larger pressure on Congress, who is less seen in the national perspective, but in charge of getting a policy legislative agenda to the president's desk. And if there is from a polling perspective, if it's a policy standpoint where you see conservatives, independent conservatives, somewhat conservatives, very conservatives, however, but a coalition of conservatives, Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, to me it seems like a no-brainer.
So, Timmy, the experience you've had in Louisiana working with the legislature, seeing this sort of situation, it does seem to me, though, that basically what Donald Trump offers people is, forget about that, I'll just give you what you want. Yeah. Isn't that kind of a difficult circumstance for Republicans to face in the next presidency?
Yeah, it is. There is a strong appeal for the strong man. To come in and set everything right. And a friend of mine told me once, a lot of times when socialism starts to fail, people start to look for a strong man who's going to make it all work. And that's a little scary. I think that for Republicans, the number one thing we need to do is shrink government. As government grows and becomes more powerful and takes more and more of our money, it takes away our freedom. It closes down education markets. It closes down the healthcare markets. It closes down the economy. We need to open it up. The only way to do that is by shrinking government. And if we just go in there and decide to use the levers of power to accomplish what we want to accomplish, because that's what the other side did, I think that's a big mistake. I think what we need to do is go in and say we're gonna shrink government. We're gonna get rid of these regulations. We're gonna get rid of the spending. We're gonna actually shrink the size of it. And we're going to open up education. We're going to open up healthcare. We're going to open up the economy for the free market. And so I hope that that's the approach that the next Republican strongman takes, is to come in and say, hey, I'm going to be a strongman in shrinking government. And I'm not going to go to battle on making the American people do what I want them to do. I'm going to go to battle against the government and make the government shrink and
I think that's certainly something that an audience that supports the Texas Public Policy Foundation can applaud.